I'm Miranda, and I'm 35 years old. The phone call came at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, whispered and urgent like something out of a spy movie. Is this Lisa Foster's sister? The voice was so quiet I had to press the phone against my ear. Your sister asked me to call you. She's been here for 3 days with broken ribs and she's scared. My blood turned to ice right there in my pajamas. Lisa hadn't returned my calls in over a week. Who is this? I whispered back, though I'm not sure why we were both whispering. I'm Sarah, one of the nurses at Memorial Hospital. I shouldn't be calling, but your sister begged me to contact you. Her husband won't let anyone visit. He keeps telling everyone she doesn't want to see anybody because she's embarrassed. The way she said embarrassed told me everything I needed to know. Because let me tell you, when a man uses the word embarrassed to describe his wife's injuries, what he really means is guilty as charged. Where exactly is she? I asked, already throwing on clothes with one hand. But then I heard footsteps approaching in the background, and the line went dead faster than my patience with men who think they own women. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt that gut-wrenching fear when someone you love goes silent. You'll definitely want to stick around for what happened next. Now, let me back up and tell you how we got to this delightful situation. Lisa and I are identical twins, and when I say identical, I mean identical. Same height, same build, same annoying habit of biting our nails when we're nervous. Even our mother mixed us up until we were teenagers, which should tell you something about maternal attention in our household. The only difference between us is a tiny scar on my left eyebrow from when I face planted off my bike at 7 years old, trying to show off for Tommy Richardson. Worth it, by the way. Tommy was very impressed by the blood. Lisa and I used to switch places constantly as kids. Classic twin stuff, really. Take each other's tests. Cover for each other when one of us was grounded. The usual shenanigans. We were partners in crime until life got complicated, and we both grew up. Lisa met her charming husband Marcus 3 years ago at her job as a dental hygienist. And when I say charming, I mean the kind of charming that sets off every alarm bell in a woman's head if she's paying attention. Unfortunately, Lisa wasn't paying attention. She was paying attention to his BMW and his smooth talk about wanting to take care of her. Red flag number 1. Any man who talks about taking care of you before he's proven he can take care of himself is planning to manage you, not love you. Marcus had all the classics in his playbook. He didn't think she needed to work after they got married because he wanted to provide for her. He had strong opinions about her friends being negative influences. He thought family dinners were drama, and she was too attached to me. But Lisa brushed off my concerns like lint off a sweater. He's protective, she'd say with that dreamy look women get when they mistake control for love. It's sweet how much he cares. Sweet. Right. About as sweet as poison in your morning coffee. The isolation happened so gradually that Lisa didn't even notice it was happening. First, she stopped coming to our weekly sister dinners because Marcus had planned something special. Then she stopped answering her phone during the day because Marcus didn't like her being distracted when he came home from work. Eventually, our conversations became these weird, stilted things where she sounded like she was reading from a script with someone standing over her shoulder. Which, as it turned out, was exactly what was happening. Over the past few months, things had gotten noticeably worse. Lisa started making excuses about bruises that would make a creative writing teacher weep. I'm so clumsy lately. She'd laugh nervously while tugging at her sleeves, walked right into the coffee table again. That coffee table was apparently more dangerous than a UFC fighter having a bad day. 2 weeks ago, she'd called me crying. Through the tears, she managed to tell me she'd asked Marcus for a divorce. The line went quiet after that, and when she finally spoke again, her voice was different. Flat. Dead. Never mind, she said. I was being dramatic. Everything's fine. Everything's fine. The universal code for everything is absolutely not fine, but I'm too scared to say it out loud. That was the last real conversation we had, until tonight's whispered phone call from a nurse with more courage than most people have in their entire bodies. I drove to Memorial Hospital like I was in a Fast and Furious movie, which is to say poorly, but with great determination. The night shift clerk gave me a look that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else when I asked about Lisa Foster. Visiting hours are over, she said in that tone that hospital staff use when they're about to deny you something important. I understand that, I replied with my sweetest smile. But I'm her emergency contact, and I just received a very concerning phone call about her condition. Sometimes you have to speak bureaucrat to get what you need. She reluctantly told me Lisa was in room 314, but warned me that her husband had left strict instructions about no visitors. Which was fine, because I wasn't planning to ask Marcus for permission to see my own sister. I took the elevator to the 3rd floor, my heart pounding like I'd just run a marathon in heels. The hallway was dimly lit with that eerie hospital lighting that makes everything look like a crime scene, which was unfortunately appropriate. Room 314 was at the end of the hall, and through the small window in the door, I could see someone sleeping in the bed. It was like looking in a mirror, if mirrors could show you a broken version of yourself. The sight of Lisa in that hospital bed hit me like a physical blow. Her left eye was swollen completely shut, turning a spectacular shade of purple that would have been artistic if it weren't so horrifying. I could see the edge of bandages wrapped around her ribs beneath the thin hospital gown, and there were finger-shaped bruises on her neck that told the whole story without words. I slipped inside as quietly as possible, though honestly, hospital doors are about as stealthy as a marching band. "Lisa," I whispered, pulling a chair close to her bed. Her good eye fluttered open, and for a terrifying second, she looked absolutely terrified. Then recognition dawned, followed immediately by panic. "Miranda," she breathed, trying to sit up and wincing in pain. "How did you— Oh God, Sarah called you, didn't she?" She looked toward the door like Marcus might materialize at any moment. "You can't be here. If he finds out—" "If he finds out what? That your sister came to check on you after you were mysteriously hospitalized with broken ribs?" I kept my voice low but firm. "Lisa, what happened? And please don't insult my intelligence by telling me you fell down the stairs." Her hand went automatically to her throat, covering the bruises like she could hide them from me. "It was an accident," she started, but I held up my hand. "Stop. Right there. We both know that's not true." The tears started then, silent and heartbreaking. I told him I wanted a divorce, Miranda. I couldn't take it anymore. The constant watching, the criticism, the way he makes me feel like I'm slowly disappearing. She touched her ribs gingerly. When I said I was leaving, he completely lost it. "Okay, we're getting you out of here," I said, my mind already racing through logistics. "When are they releasing you?" "Tomorrow morning." "But Miranda, I can't go home. I don't have anywhere to go. He controls everything, the bank accounts, the credit cards. Even my car is in his name." Her voice was getting smaller with each word, and I could see how thoroughly Marcus had trapped her. That's when the idea hit me. It was absolutely insane, possibly illegal, but it might just work. And honestly, at this point, conventional wisdom had clearly failed my sister. "You're coming to stay with me," I said. "But first, we're going to make sure Marcus gets exactly what's coming to him." Lisa looked confused. "What do you mean?" I leaned closer, lowering my voice to barely a whisper. "Remember when we used to switch places in high school? Mrs. Henderson never could tell us apart, even when she was looking directly at us." Understanding dawned slowly in Lisa's eyes, followed by terror. "Miranda, no, it's too dangerous. If he finds out it's not me, he won't find out. Look at us, Lisa. We're identical. And more importantly, men like Marcus don't actually see their wives as real people. To him, you're just an object he owns. He won't be looking for subtle differences because he's not actually looking at you at all." I spent the next hour studying every detail of Lisa's current appearance. How she wore her hair, the nervous way she touched her ear when she was anxious, the small birthmark on her wrist that I'd need to cover with makeup, even the careful way she moved when her ribs hurt. "The key is understanding that abusers like Marcus live in their own little worlds," I explained. "He thinks he broke you. He thinks you're scared and submissive now. He's expecting a certain version of you, and that's exactly what I'll give him. But what if he realizes—" "Lisa, honey, narcissists like Marcus are remarkably predictable. They see what they want to see. He wants to see a broken, compliant wife who's learned her lesson. So that's exactly what he'll get. Except this broken wife is going to be recording every word he says." The next morning, I helped Lisa check out of the hospital, which involved more paperwork than buying a house and twice as many suspicious looks from the staff. Lisa moved carefully, obviously in pain, but there was something different in her eyes. Not hope exactly, but maybe the beginning of hope. We drove straight to my apartment, where I'd spent the early morning hours ordering spy equipment online with same-day delivery. Because apparently, in the modern world, you can have tiny recording devices delivered faster than pizza. "The first few days will be crucial," I explained, showing Lisa the surveillance equipment that looked like something out of a spy movie. "I need to learn his patterns, document his behavior, and most importantly, get him to incriminate himself on tape." Lisa stared at the tiny recording devices. "This is really happening, isn't it?" "Oh, it's happening all right. Marcus has spent years terrorizing you in private, counting on your silence to protect him. Well, surprise, he picked the wrong victim this time." I smiled, and it wasn't a nice smile. He has no idea he's about to face someone who fights back. That evening, I prepared to enter enemy territory. I'd practiced Lisa's walk, her posture, even the way she held her shoulders slightly hunched when she was nervous. I'd studied photos of her with Marcus, noting how she looked at him, how she positioned herself in relation to him. The key to a successful impersonation isn't just looking like someone, it's understanding their psychology. And I understood exactly how Marcus had trained Lisa to behave around him. As I drove toward the house they shared, I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. Lisa had endured years of this man's abuse because she'd had no choice. But I had choices, and I was about to use every single one of them. Marcus was about to discover that his helpless victim had an identical twin sister who'd spent her entire life refusing to be intimidated by bullies. This was going to be interesting. And by interesting, I mean absolutely devastating for Marcus, though he didn't know that yet. Walking into that house felt like entering a perfectly curated prison. Everything was spotless, organized, and completely devoid of Lisa's personality. I could see traces of who she used to be, hidden away in corners like contraband. A single photo of us together, tucked behind a lamp. Her favorite books relegated to one small shelf in the hallway. Her plants, which she used to love, were either dead or dying from obvious neglect. The message was clear. This was Marcus's world, and Lisa was just allowed to exist in it on his terms. "Lisa!" Marcus's voice called from the living room. "You're finally home. It's about time." I took a deep breath and walked toward the sound of his voice, mentally preparing myself to meet the man who'd put my sister in the hospital. He was sitting in his recliner like some kind of discount king, beer in hand, watching sports highlights with the volume unnecessarily loud. He barely glanced at me when I entered the room, which told me everything I needed to know about how much attention he usually paid to Lisa. Perfect for my purposes, terrible for my faith in humanity. "Grab me another beer," he said without looking away from the TV, "and heat up the Chinese food in the kitchen. I already ate, but you can have the leftovers." I bit my tongue so hard I'm surprised it didn't bleed. In what universe do you tell someone who just got out of the hospital with broken ribs to serve you beer and heat up your leftovers? Oh, right. Marcus's universe. Instead of telling him exactly where he could put his beer and his leftovers, I nodded and headed to the kitchen. Time to start documenting this charming man's behavior. I slipped one of my recording devices under the kitchen counter edge while getting his beer. First rule of gathering evidence. Start immediately, because men like Marcus can't help themselves from being terrible. The kitchen was as sterile as the rest of the house, everything in its assigned place like a museum display. I found the Chinese food containers in the refrigerator, noting that he'd ordered enough for 2 people but apparently eaten most of it himself. Thoughtful. "Lisa!" Marcus barked from the living room. "What's taking so long?" I brought him his beer, keeping my eyes down the way Lisa had taught me he expected. "Sorry," I mumbled, handing him the bottle. He finally looked at me then, his eyes scanning my face with the kind of casual ownership that made my skin crawl. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought he'd figured it out. Then he grabbed my wrist, pressing his fingers right where I knew Lisa's bruises would be the darkest. "You learned your lesson, didn't you?" he said, applying just enough pressure to make me wince. All that drama at the hospital could have been avoided if you'd just been reasonable from the beginning. I forced myself to nod, even though every fiber of my being wanted to break his fingers. Instead, I filed away his words. Confession number 1, admitting that Lisa's lesson involved violence and that he considered domestic violence a reasonable response to disagreement. "Good," he said, releasing my wrist. "I don't want to have to teach you twice." Confession number 2, a clear threat of future violence. This was almost too easy. I spent the rest of the evening observing Marcus's behavior patterns like a wildlife researcher studying a particularly unpleasant species. He expected complete attention when he spoke, absolute silence when he was watching TV, and instant compliance with every demand, no matter how ridiculous. He criticized everything from how I heated up the Chinese food to the way I folded his laundry. Every comment was designed to chip away at self-esteem, to make his victim feel small and inadequate. It was psychological warfare disguised as marriage, and it was absolutely sickening. But here's the thing about bullies. They're actually incredibly predictable once you understand their psychology. Marcus's entire sense of self-worth depended on feeling superior to Lisa, which meant he had to constantly tear her down to build himself up. Pathetic, really, when you think about it. Around 10 p.m., he announced he was going to bed and expected me to clean up properly before joining him. The thought of sharing a bed with this monster made my skin crawl, but I'd prepared for this possibility. I waited until I heard him snoring, then slipped out of the bedroom and made myself a nest on the living room couch. If he asked about it in the morning, I'd blame nightmares from my accident at the hospital. Men like Marcus love thinking their victims are traumatized. It feeds their sick egos. Sleep was impossible anyway. Every sound made me jump. Every creak of the house set my nerves on edge. I was experiencing just a tiny taste of what Lisa had lived with for years, and it was already affecting me after just one night. I used the quiet hours to plant more recording devices around the house, The kitchen, where Marcus seemed to do most of his verbal abuse. The living room, where he held court like some twisted monarch. Even the bedroom, in case he said anything incriminating while he thought Lisa was asleep. By morning, Marcus's house was more thoroughly bugged than a mob boss's office. And unlike Lisa, I wasn't going to suffer in silence. Every threat, every cruel comment, every moment of his true character was going to be documented and preserved for posterity. Marcus Hendricks was about to learn that his days of terrorizing women in private were over. He just didn't know it yet. And honestly, I was looking forward to being the one to teach him that lesson. Marcus woke up in his typical charming fashion, demanding coffee and immediately launching into criticism mode. "I see you abandoned me again last night," he said, eyeing the blanket and pillow I'd used on the couch. "Still being dramatic about your little accident, I see. Little accident." The man had put his wife in the hospital with broken ribs, and he was calling it a little accident. The audacity was almost impressive, in a completely horrifying way. "Sorry," I mumbled, playing the part of the apologetic wife while mentally cataloging his words. "I had nightmares." "Well, you need to get over it," he said dismissively. "I'm not going to baby you forever, Lisa. Life goes on." I nodded and started making his coffee exactly the way Lisa had instructed me. Black, 2 sugars, in his favorite mug that proclaimed him world's best husband. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife, though I suspected Marcus was too dense to appreciate it. As I moved around the kitchen, I made sure to trigger the recording devices I'd planted the night before. Every condescending comment, every casual cruelty was being captured for posterity. Future prosecutors were going to have a field day with this material. "I want this house spotless by the time I get home tonight," Marcus announced, pulling out a handwritten list that would have made a drill sergeant weep. "And I mean spotless, Lisa. I'll be checking." I stared at the list. Deep clean the bathroom, vacuum every room, dust every surface, reorganize the pantry, wash all the windows, do laundry, grocery shop, and somehow find time to prepare a 3-course dinner. All while supposedly recovering from broken ribs. "This seems like a lot for someone who just got out of the hospital," I said carefully, testing how he'd react to the mildest pushback. His expression darkened immediately, like storm clouds gathering. "Are you questioning me? After what happened this week, I'd think you'd be eager to prove you can handle your responsibilities." "After what happened? Not after your accident, or after you got hurt. After what happened like it was some mysterious natural disaster instead of him beating his wife unconscious." "Of course not," I said quickly. "I'll get everything done." "Good. I'm glad we understand each other." He grabbed his keys and briefcase, then paused at the door. "Oh, and Lisa, my mother is coming for dinner Sunday. I expect you to make that roast she likes, and I expect you to be pleasant. None of this moping around feeling sorry for yourself." The door slammed behind him, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence of his perfectly controlled world. I counted to 30, then let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Finally, I could drop the act and think clearly. I spent the morning doing just enough of Marcus's ridiculous cleaning list to make it look like I'd tried, while focusing on more important tasks, like searching his home office for incriminating evidence. Marcus was the type of man who kept everything, probably because control freaks love documentation. I found a shoebox in his closet that made me physically ill. Photos of Lisa's previous bruises, apparently taken as some kind of twisted trophy collection. Text messages he'd screenshotted where she'd apologized for things that weren't remotely her fault. Most disturbing was a handwritten list titled, "Lisa's Areas for Improvement." Reading it was like getting a masterclass in psychological abuse. Stop being so sensitive. Learn to accept feedback gracefully. Reduce contact with family. Remember who provides for this household. Each item was a weapon designed to chip away at Lisa's sense of self, until she believed she was lucky to have him. It was systematic, methodical, and absolutely evil. I photographed everything, my hands shaking with rage. This wasn't just domestic violence, it was a calculated campaign to destroy another human being's spirit. But the real treasure trove was his laptop. Marcus was the kind of man who saved every password in his browser, probably because he'd never imagined anyone would dare invade his private sanctuary. I found email threads with his buddies where he bragged about keeping Lisa in line. I found Google searches for articles about asset protection during divorce proceedings. Most damning were his internet searches from the night he'd put Lisa in the hospital. How to explain broken ribs. Domestic violence laws in Ohio. Can wife file for divorce without access to funds? He'd been planning his defense before Lisa's swelling had even gone down. I copied everything to a secure cloud account, then went through his financial records. The picture that emerged was of a man who'd been systematically stealing Lisa's independence. Her savings account, her small inheritance from our grandmother, even her car title had all been transferred to his name only. Around noon, His mother, Patricia, called. I almost didn't answer, but then realized this could provide valuable intelligence about the family dynamics that enabled Marcus's behavior. Lisa, dear, came the voice of a woman who'd clearly mastered the art of passive-aggressive concern. Marcus told me about your little tumble. I hope you're feeling better. Tumble. Of course, that's how the family was spinning it. I'm managing, I said carefully. Good, good. You know, dear, Marcus is under tremendous pressure at work right now. He's up for a promotion, and he really doesn't need any additional stress at home. I'm sure you understand. Translation. Stop causing problems for my precious son by having inconvenient reactions to being beaten. I understand completely, I replied, making sure my recorder was capturing every word of this delightful conversation. I knew you would. You're a sensible girl, not like some wives who make mountains out of molehills. Marriage requires sacrifice, dear. Sometimes that means putting your husband's needs first. By the time I hung up, I understood exactly where Marcus had learned that his behavior was acceptable. He'd been raised by a woman who believed wives existed to serve their husbands, regardless of the cost to themselves. The afternoon flew by as I documented more evidence and prepared for Marcus's return. By the time his car pulled into the driveway, I had enough material to destroy him completely, but I was just getting started. Marcus was about to spend several more days revealing his true character to someone he thought was too broken to fight back. He had no idea he was actually confessing to someone who was taking very detailed notes. Marcus came home that evening in an especially foul mood, slamming the door and immediately launching into complaints about work stress and my inadequate housekeeping. Apparently, the house I'd spent the day cleaning wasn't spotless enough for his royal standards. "Did you even vacuum the living room?" he demanded, running his finger along a surface that looked perfectly clean to me. "And what's this?" He held up a coffee mug I'd left in the sink. "I thought I made it clear that I expect this house maintained properly." I wanted to suggest that if he was so concerned about housekeeping, he was welcome to pick up a vacuum himself. Instead, I apologized and rushed to rewash his precious mug, all while my hidden recorders captured his charming personality. "You're pathetic, Lisa," he said, settling into his throne-like recliner. "I don't know why I even bothered trying to help you become a better person. You just don't seem capable of improvement. Help me become a better person." The man was rewriting history in real time, casting his abuse as some kind of self-improvement program. The delusion was almost impressive. "I'm trying," I said in the small, defeated voice Lisa had learned to use around him. "Are you? Because from where I sit, it looks like you're just going through the motions, hoping I'll forget about your behavior and let things go back to normal." He leaned forward, his voice taking on that dangerous edge I was starting to recognize. "But there is no normal anymore, Lisa. You changed that when you decided to disrespect me and our marriage." Disrespect him? By asking for a divorce from her abuser, Lisa had apparently committed the ultimate sin in Marcus's twisted worldview. "I understand," I said. Though what I actually understood was that this man was providing me with a confession that would hold up in any court in the country. Over the next hour, Marcus treated me to a detailed lecture about my failings as a wife, punctuated by increasingly specific threats about what would happen if I didn't show proper appreciation for his patience and generosity. Every word was pure gold for my evidence collection. The most revealing moment came when he started talking about my family. "Your sister Miranda has always been a bad influence on you," he said, taking a long drink of beer. "Always filling your head with ideas about independence and standing up for yourself. She doesn't understand marriage the way we do." Oh, Marcus, if only you knew how well Miranda understood exactly what kind of marriage this was. "I don't want you talking to her anymore," he continued. "In fact, I think it's time we moved somewhere new, away from all these negative influences. I've been looking at houses in other states, places where we can start fresh." Isolation, the classic abuser playbook, removing the victim from anyone who might help or support them. If I'd been the real Lisa, this would have been terrifying. As Miranda, I just saw it as more evidence of his systematic control. "What about my job?" I asked, testing how he'd respond. "You don't need a job, Lisa. I provide for you. Your job is taking care of our home and making me happy. Isn't that enough?" "Apparently not, since you spend most of your time criticizing everything I do," I thought but didn't say. That night, I lay on the couch listening to Marcus snore and planning my next moves. I had enough evidence already to prove systematic abuse, but I wanted to be absolutely certain the case against him was airtight. I also wanted to understand the full scope of his control, to document every aspect of how he'd trapped Lisa so thoroughly that she'd believed she had no way out. The next morning brought more of Marcus's delightful personality. He woke up early and decided I should too, shaking me awake at 5:30 a.m. to inform me that he'd be having colleagues over for dinner that weekend and expected me to prepare an elaborate meal. "I want you to make that salmon dish you made for my birthday," he said, "and make sure you look presentable." These are important people, and I need them to see that I have a wife who knows how to behave properly. A wife who knows how to behave properly. Like I was a trained dog performing tricks for his business associates. Of course, I said, though internally I was noting that he apparently viewed me as a prop in his professional image rather than as an actual person. And Lisa, he added, his tone shifting to that false concern that was somehow more chilling than his outright threats. I hope you're not planning to embarrass me by mentioning your little accident to anyone. People don't need to hear about our private business. Our private business. That's what he called putting his wife in the hospital. I won't say anything, I assured him, though what I meant was that I wouldn't say anything until I said everything to exactly the right people. As Marcus left for work, I felt a grim satisfaction settling over me. He thought he'd broken Lisa's spirit so thoroughly that she'd never fight back. He thought he'd found the perfect victim, someone who'd absorb his abuse in grateful silence. What he'd actually found was someone with an identical twin sister who'd spent her entire life learning how to outwit bullies and protect the people she loved. Marcus had no idea that his perfect victim was about to become his perfect nightmare. By the third day, Marcus had settled into what I assumed was his normal routine of casual cruelty and constant surveillance. He'd started leaving little tests around the house, moving objects to see if I'd notice, checking to make sure I was following his instructions to the letter. What he didn't know was that I was conducting my own surveillance operation, and I was much better at it than he was. I'd discovered his hiding places for important documents, figured out his computer passwords, and even found the spare keys he'd hidden around the house, probably as backup in case he needed to lock me in or out. Every piece of evidence I gathered painted a clearer picture of a man who'd turned marriage into a hostage situation. The most damning evidence came from his phone records, which showed he'd been tracking Lisa's location constantly, monitoring her calls, and even accessing her social media accounts without permission. He'd turned every tool of modern technology into a weapon of control. But Marcus's biggest mistake was thinking that broken ribs had somehow fixed what he saw as Lisa's attitude problem. He'd become careless, saying things out loud that he probably usually kept to himself, confident that his victim was too scared and isolated to ever use his words against him. "You know what your problem was, Lisa?" he said over dinner, cutting into his steak with more force than necessary. "You thought you were my equal. You thought marriage was some kind of partnership where you got to have opinions and make demands." I nodded, playing the part of the chastened wife while my recording device captured every word of his charming worldview. "But that's not how marriage works," he continued, warming to his subject. "I'm the man. I make the decisions, I provide the income, I set the rules. Your job is to support me and make my life easier. When you understand that, everything will be fine between us. When you understand that." As if accepting complete subjugation was some kind of enlightenment rather than the destruction of Lisa's personhood. "I understand now," I said quietly. "Do you? Because I'm not convinced. You're still too tense, still watching me like you're afraid of me." He smiled, and it was the most disturbing expression I'd ever seen on a human face. "You should be afraid of me, Lisa. A little fear keeps women honest. A little fear keeps women honest." I almost choked on my food. This man was providing me with quotes that would be featured in domestic violence training seminars for years to come. "I learned my lesson," I said, using the phrase he'd used that first night. "Good, because I'd hate to have to teach you again." That night, Marcus fell asleep early, apparently satisfied that he'd successfully terrorized his wife back into submission. While he snored, I compiled all the evidence I'd gathered into a comprehensive file that would make any prosecutor weep with joy. Photos of Lisa's injuries from the hospital. Audio recordings of Marcus admitting to violence and threatening future violence. Documentation of financial abuse, isolation tactics, and surveillance. Screenshots of his internet searches about hiding domestic violence and preventing divorce. But the crown jewel was a recorded conversation from earlier that day where Marcus had explained to me, in detail, exactly how he'd trained Lisa to behave properly over the years. How he'd gradually isolated her from friends and family, how he'd taken control of her finances to prevent her from leaving, how he'd used fear and intimidation to keep her compliant. He'd laid out his entire systematic approach to psychological and physical abuse, like he was explaining a business plan, which in his mind was probably exactly what it was. The next morning, I made the call that would change everything. "Detective Sarah Morrison, Domestic Violence Unit. Detective Morrison, my name is Miranda Foster, and I have extensive evidence of ongoing domestic violence that I need to report." "What kind of evidence are we talking about, Ms. Foster?" "Audio recordings of threats and admissions of violence, documentation of financial abuse, medical records showing injuries, and testimony from the victim." There was a pause. "How extensive is this evidence?" "Detective, I have enough documentation to prove systematic abuse spanning several years, plus clear evidence that the perpetrator represents an ongoing danger to the victim. Can you come in this afternoon? I'll be there. As I drove to the police station that afternoon, I felt a sense of profound satisfaction. Marcus had spent years terrorizing Lisa in private, counting on her silence and isolation to protect him from consequences. He'd never imagined that his perfect victim had an identical twin sister who knew how to turn his own tactics against him. By evening, Detective Morrison had reviewed my evidence and assured me that they had more than enough to obtain an arrest warrant. The wheels of justice were finally turning, and Marcus was about to discover that his reign of terror was over. He just didn't know it yet. Detective Morrison was exactly the kind of person you'd want handling a case like this. Sharp, thorough, and clearly disgusted by men like Marcus. She spent 2 hours going through my evidence with the intensity of a scholar analyzing ancient texts. "This is remarkably comprehensive," she said, studying the audio recordings. "Most domestic violence cases struggle with lack of evidence. You've documented a complete pattern of abuse with multiple types of evidence supporting each incident." "I had a highly motivated subject," I replied. "Marcus couldn't help himself from being awful once he thought I was properly broken." She smiled grimly. "Men like him usually can't. They view compliance as permission to reveal their true nature." She closed the file and looked at me directly. "There's one thing we need to discuss before we proceed." Here it comes, I thought, the part where I explain the twin switch. "You're not actually Lisa Foster, are you?" "No, I'm her identical twin sister Miranda. Lisa is recovering at my apartment while I've been gathering evidence by impersonating her." Detective Morrison nodded like this was a perfectly normal Tuesday afternoon conversation. "I figured as much. Lisa's medical records indicate someone who'd be moving much more carefully than you have been. Plus, domestic violence victims rarely come in with evidence this organized. Does that create legal problems for the case?" "Not at all. You were gathering evidence of crimes committed against your sister by posing as her. The recordings are of Marcus's actual statements and behaviors. The fact that he thought he was talking to Lisa instead of you doesn't change what he said or did." She pulled out her laptop and began typing. "We'll need Lisa's statement confirming the abuse and authorizing you to act on her behalf. We'll also need you to testify about what you observed and recorded. But with this evidence, we can obtain an arrest warrant immediately." "How immediately?" "Tomorrow morning. We'll pick him up at his office, nice and public, so his colleagues can see exactly what kind of man they've been working with." I felt a surge of satisfaction. Marcus cared so much about his professional image, and that image was about to be completely destroyed. What should I do tonight? Go home, act normal, don't give him any reason to suspect anything has changed. We'll handle everything from here. That evening, I returned to Marcus's house for what I knew would be the last time. He was in his usual position on his throne, beer in hand, ready to criticize my day's performance. "You seem different today," he said, studying my face with those cold, calculating eyes. "Less jumpy." "I hope you're not getting overconfident about our situation." "Not at all," I replied. "I think I'm just finally accepting reality." "Good, because your reality is that you belong to me, Lisa. You're my wife, in my house, dependent on my money and my generosity. The sooner you fully internalize that, the easier your life will be. You belong to me." I almost laughed out loud. This man was still providing quotable content even on his last day of freedom. "I understand," I said, and for the first time, I was telling the complete truth. I did understand. I understood exactly what kind of monster Marcus was, and I understood that tomorrow he'd be in handcuffs. That night, Marcus fell asleep early, apparently satisfied that he'd successfully crushed his wife's spirit. He had no idea that the woman lying on his couch was mentally composing a victory speech for when he was led away in chains. I didn't sleep much, not because I was afraid, but because I was too excited about what tomorrow would bring. Marcus Hendricks had built his entire sense of power on being able to terrorize a woman in private without consequences. Tomorrow, he was going to discover that the real world had different rules than his carefully controlled house of horrors. What do you think will happen next? Drop your predictions in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you want to see how this incredible story ends. As dawn broke, I prepared for the most satisfying morning of my adult life. Marcus was about to learn that some women fight back, and when they do, bullies like him don't win. They don't win at all. Morning came with Marcus in his typical charming mood, complaining about the coffee temperature and announcing that he'd be working late all week because his incompetent colleagues couldn't handle their responsibilities without constant supervision. If only he knew how his day was really going to go. "I want you to start looking at real estate listings for other states," he said, adjusting his tie with the self-importance of a man who had no idea his world was about to collapse. "I'm thinking somewhere in the South where people understand traditional values." Traditional values, that's what he called domestic violence. Of course, I said, playing my part one last time. Any particular state? Somewhere without your sister's influence, he replied, and I had to bite my tongue to keep from smiling. I've decided she's been a toxic presence in our marriage, and it's time to cut those ties permanently. Cut ties permanently. Even his casual conversation sounded like threats. This man really couldn't help himself. Marcus left for work at his usual time, briefcase in hand, completely oblivious to the fact that this would be his last morning as a free man. I watched his car disappear down the street and allowed myself a moment of pure anticipation. By noon, Detective Morrison called with an update that made my entire week. "We got him," she said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. Picked him up at his office in front of half his company. The look on his face was priceless. How did he react? Classic narcissist breakdown. First, he tried to charm his way out of it. Then he got angry and started making threats. Finally, he settled on playing the victim, claiming you'd made everything up because you were mentally unstable. Mentally unstable. Of course, that would be his defense. When all else fails, blame the victim's sanity. Did he ask for a lawyer? Eventually, but not before providing us with some additional incriminating statements. Apparently, he couldn't resist explaining to the arresting officers that wives sometimes need correction and that we were interfering with his right to manage his own household. I actually did laugh out loud at that. Marcus had been so confident in his worldview that he'd continued defending domestic violence even while being arrested for it. What happens next? He's being booked now. With the evidence you provided, he'll be held without bail pending arraignment. The charges are serious, and given the documented pattern of escalating violence, the judge will consider him a flight risk. That afternoon, I drove to my apartment to reunite with Lisa and tell her that her nightmare was finally over. I found her sitting by the window, still moving carefully, but looking more like herself than she had in years. "It's done," I told her. "Marcus has been arrested. He's in jail, and he's not coming out anytime soon." The relief on her face was worth every terrifying moment I'd spent in that house. For the first time in years, Lisa smiled without fear. "I can't believe you actually did it," she said, shaking her head. "When you first suggested the plan, I thought it was crazy. It was crazy, but sometimes crazy is exactly what the situation demands." We spent the afternoon with Lisa's attorney, Margaret Chen, a no-nonsense woman who specialized in domestic violence cases and divorce law. Margaret reviewed the evidence with professional admiration. "This is the most comprehensive documentation of systematic abuse I've ever seen," she said. "Most victims struggle to prove their cases because abusers are careful to maintain plausible deniability. You've eliminated that completely." "What are we looking at in terms of charges?" I asked. "Multiple felonies, aggravated assault, criminal harassment, financial fraud, and possibly stalking charges depending on how far back his surveillance goes. He's looking at significant prison time." Lisa was quiet during most of the legal discussion, processing the reality that her abuser would actually face consequences for his actions. In her world, Marcus had been untouchable, too clever and careful to ever be caught. "Will I have to see him again?" she asked quietly. "Not if you don't want to," Margaret assured her. "With the evidence Miranda gathered, this case will likely end in a plea deal. Marcus's attorney will advise him to avoid trial rather than have all his recorded confessions played for a jury." That evening, Lisa and I sat in my living room, sharing takeout Chinese food and marveling at how much had changed in just 1 week. "I keep expecting him to walk through the door," Lisa admitted. 3 years of living in fear doesn't disappear overnight." "It will take time," I said. "But Lisa, you're free now. Really, truly free to make your own decisions about your life. What do you think I should do first?" "Whatever makes you happy. You've spent years having every choice made for you. Now you get to choose everything." As if on cue, her phone buzzed with a text from David, the paramedic she'd met during one of her previous hospital visits. He'd been checking on her recovery and sending encouraging messages all week. "He wants to take me to dinner when I'm feeling better," she said, showing me the message. "And how do you feel about that?" "Terrified," she admitted, "but also excited. Is that normal?" "Completely normal. You're remembering what it feels like to have options." That night, I fell asleep on my own couch while Lisa took my bed, both of us finally able to rest without fear. Marcus was behind bars, his carefully constructed world of control and terror reduced to rubble. Tomorrow would bring arraignment hearings and legal proceedings, but tonight, justice had been served with a side of poetic irony. Marcus had spent years believing he was smarter than everyone around him, especially the women he chose to abuse. He'd never imagined that his perfect victim had an identical twin sister who was more than smart enough to turn his own tactics against him. The arraignment was scheduled for Friday morning, and Marcus's attorney had already reached out asking about plea negotiations. Apparently, when faced with hours of recorded confessions and comprehensive documentation of systematic abuse, even high-priced lawyers recognize a losing battle. Lisa and I arrived at the courthouse early, flanked by Detective Morrison and Margaret Chen. The hallways were buzzing with reporters who'd caught wind of the unusual case, though most of the coverage focused on the investigative methods rather than the abuse itself. "Twin sister goes undercover to catch abusive husband" was the headline that made me cringe, even though it was technically accurate. I would have preferred "local man arrested for domestic violence," but apparently that wasn't sensational enough for modern journalism. We took our seats in the gallery, and I got my first look at Marcus since his arrest. The confident businessman was gone, replaced by a man in an orange jumpsuit who kept scanning the courtroom like he was looking for an escape route. His eyes found Lisa first, then swiveled to me, and I watched realization dawn across his face. He stared at me for a long moment, his mind clearly racing as he tried to process what he was seeing. Then he looked back at Lisa, then at me again, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding to absolute fury. The bailiff called for order as Judge Patricia Walsh entered the courtroom. She reviewed the charges with the kind of no-nonsense efficiency that suggested she'd seen too many cases like this one. "Mr. Hendricks, you are charged with aggravated assault, criminal harassment, financial fraud, and stalking. How do you plead?" Marcus's attorney leaned over to whisper something, but Marcus wasn't listening. He was still staring at Lisa and me with that expression of shocked rage, his brain finally putting together exactly how thoroughly he'd been outplayed. "Mr. Hendricks?" the judge prompted. "Not guilty," he said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Santos, began outlining the state's case. She detailed the evidence methodically: photographs of Lisa's injuries, financial records showing systematic theft, audio recordings of threats and admissions of violence. But the moment that made the entire courtroom gasp was when Ada Santos explained exactly how the evidence had been gathered. "Your Honor, this evidence was collected over a period of 1 week by Miranda Foster, acting on behalf of her identical twin sister, Lisa Foster Hendricks. Ms. Foster posed as the victim in order to document the defendant's abusive behavior in his natural environment." The murmur that went through the courtroom was audible. Marcus's head snapped up, his eyes darting between Lisa and me as the full scope of what had happened finally sank in. "During this week," Ada Santos continued, "the defendant made numerous threats against what he believed to be his wife, admitted to previous violence, and detailed his methods for controlling and isolating the victim." Marcus's attorney objected, claiming entrapment, but Judge Walsh shut that down quickly. "Counselor, your client wasn't entrapped into revealing his character. He chose to make threats and admissions to someone he believed was his wife. The fact that it was actually his sister-in-law doesn't change the content or intent of his statements." The hearing continued with Detective Morrison detailing the investigation and Margaret Chen explaining the systematic nature of the abuse. By the time they finished, Marcus looked like a man who'd realized his entire world had collapsed while he wasn't paying attention. During the lunch recess, Marcus's attorney approached our table with the defeated expression of someone who knew their client was doomed. "We'd like to discuss a plea agreement," he said quietly. "What kind of plea?" Margaret asked. "My client is willing to accept responsibility for a reduced charge. Misdemeanor assault, anger management counseling, maybe some community service." Ada Santos didn't even blink. "Your client systematically abused his wife for years and was planning to escalate further. We're not interested in reduced charges." The evidence-gathering methods were unconventional. The evidence-gathering methods were brilliant, Judge Walsh interjected from behind us. We turned to find her listening to the conversation during her break. "Your client provided hours of recorded confessions. The fact that he was too arrogant to realize he wasn't speaking to his wife doesn't make the confessions inadmissible." The attorney tried several more approaches, but we weren't budging. Marcus had terrorized Lisa for years, and he was going to face the full consequences of his choices. When court reconvened, the judge set a trial date for the following month, though everyone in the room knew it would never reach trial. Marcus's case was hopeless, and his attorney would eventually convince him to accept whatever plea deal he could get. But the most satisfying moment came at the very end of the hearing, when Marcus was being led back to his holding cell. He looked directly at me and mouthed the words, "You bitch." I smiled and gave him a little wave. Poor Marcus. He'd spent years believing he was the smartest person in every room, especially when that room contained women he thought he could control and intimidate. He'd never considered the possibility that his victim might have an identical twin sister who was more than capable of beating him at his own game. As we left the courthouse that afternoon, Lisa seemed lighter somehow, like a weight she'd been carrying for years had finally been lifted from her shoulders. "Is it really over?" she asked. "The legal case is just beginning," I replied. "But yes, it's over for you. Marcus will never hurt you again. That evening, we celebrated with wine and terrible reality TV, reveling in the simple pleasure of making noise without worrying about disturbing an abusive man's sleep. Marcus was spending his first night in jail, probably lying awake wondering how his perfect system of control had been so thoroughly destroyed. I hoped he was having trouble sleeping. He deserved every moment of discomfort coming his way. The trial was set to begin on a Monday morning in early October, but Marcus's attorney called over the weekend to request an emergency meeting. Apparently, 3 months in jail had given Marcus time to reconsider his position on plea negotiations. We met at Ada Santos's office, a cramped space filled with case files and the kind of fluorescent lighting that makes everyone look guilty of something. Marcus's attorney, James Wright, looked like a man who'd aged a decade in 3 months. My client would like to revisit the possibility of a plea agreement, Wright began carefully. What's he offering? Santos asked, though her tone suggested she wasn't optimistic about whatever Marcus had come up with. Guilty plea to simple assault. 2 years probation, anger management classes, and a permanent restraining order. I almost laughed out loud. After months of evidence compilation, Marcus thought he could plead down to essentially a slap on the wrist. Your client put my sister in the hospital with broken ribs, I said calmly. He systematically stole her money, isolated her from family, and made detailed threats about future violence. You think that's worth 2 years probation? Wright shifted uncomfortably. My client acknowledges that emotions ran high during their marital difficulties. Emotions ran high? Lisa spoke for the first time since we'd sat down. Is that what you call choking someone unconscious and breaking their ribs? Mrs. Foster Hendricks, I understand you're upset, but we need to be realistic about what we can prove in court. Santos interrupted him. Counselor, we have hours of recorded confessions from your client. We have medical records documenting systematic abuse. We have financial records showing theft and control. We can prove everything. Recordings taken without my client's knowledge. By someone acting on behalf of the victim to document ongoing crimes, Santos finished. We've been over this. The evidence is admissible, it's comprehensive, and it's devastating to your client's case. Wright tried several more approaches, but it was clear he was grasping at straws. Marcus had provided so much evidence against himself that there was literally no defense strategy that could save him. Finally, Wright played his last card. My client would like to speak directly to Mrs. Foster Hendricks. He believes there may be misunderstandings that could be resolved through direct communication. The silence in the room was deafening. Absolutely not, Margaret Chen said firmly. That's exactly the kind of manipulation tactic that got us here in the first place. Mr. Wright, Santos added, are you seriously suggesting that we allow your client to intimidate the victim directly? Because that's what this sounds like. Not intimidation, Wright said quickly. Just clarification of events. I looked at Lisa, who was shaking her head emphatically. The last thing she needed was more manipulation from Marcus. The only clarification your client needs, I said, is that his reign of terror is over. Lisa is not interested in being manipulated by him ever again. Wright gathered his papers with the defeated air of a man who'd run out of options. We'll be in touch if my client wants to make a more realistic offer. After he left, Santos turned to us with a grim smile. They're getting desperate. Wright knows this case is unwinnable, but Marcus probably isn't ready to accept reality yet. What happens if he doesn't take a plea? Lisa asked. We go to trial, I play his recorded confessions for a jury of 12 people, and he gets convicted on all charges. Then he gets sentenced to significantly more time than he'd receive in a plea deal. How much more time? With the charges he's facing and his complete lack of remorse, 10 to 15 years minimum. 3 days later, Wright called back with a different offer. Marcus was now willing to plead guilty to aggravated assault and accept 5 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 3. It was still too generous for my taste, but Santos explained the realities of the legal system. A guaranteed conviction and prison time is better than risking an unpredictable jury, she said. With his behavior in court so far, there's a chance Marcus could alienate the jury enough to get the maximum sentence, but there's also a chance some jury member might sympathize with him. Lisa thought about it for several days before making her decision. I want this to be over, she said finally. I want him in prison where he can't hurt anyone else. And I want to move on with my life. If 5 years accomplishes that, I can live with 5 years. The plea hearing was scheduled for the following Friday. Marcus would formally admit his guilt and be sentenced immediately. That night, I called Detective Morrison to thank her for everything she'd done to make the case possible. You know, she said, in 15 years of working domestic violence cases, I've never seen anything like what you did. Most victims never get justice because abusers are too careful to leave evidence. Marcus wasn't careful, I replied. He was arrogant. He thought Lisa was too broken to fight back, so he got sloppy. Well, his arrogance is about to cost him 5 years of his life. Friday morning arrived with crisp autumn air and the kind of clear skies that felt like a good omen. Lisa and I dressed carefully for court, not because appearance mattered for the outcome, but because we wanted to look strong and confident when Marcus formally admitted his guilt. The courtroom was less crowded this time, mostly family members and court officials. Marcus sat at the defendant's table looking pale and defeated, a far cry from the arrogant man who'd terrorized Lisa for years. Judge Walsh called the proceedings to order and addressed Marcus directly. "Mr. Hendricks, your attorney has informed the court that you wish to enter a guilty plea. Is this correct?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And you understand that by pleading guilty, you are admitting to the charges against you and waiving your right to trial?" "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Walsh then read the charges aloud, each one a formal acknowledgement of Marcus's crimes against Lisa. When she finished, she asked the question that would end this chapter of Lisa's life forever. "How do you plead to the charge of aggravated domestic violence?" Marcus stood slowly, his hands shaking slightly. "Guilty, Your Honor." The words hung in the air like a bell that had finally stopped tolling. After years of abuse, months of legal proceedings, and countless hours of fear, Marcus had finally admitted what everyone in that courtroom already knew. He was guilty. Judge Walsh scheduled sentencing for the following week, giving Marcus time to prepare victim impact statements and Marcus one last chance to show remorse before she determined his fate. Though given his behavior throughout the proceedings, I wasn't holding my breath for any meaningful acknowledgement of the harm he'd caused. Lisa spent the week writing her statement, pages and pages of everything Marcus had stolen from her. Her confidence, her independence, her sense of safety in the world. She wrote about the years of walking on eggshells, about learning to make herself small and quiet to avoid triggering his rage, about the slow erosion of her sense of self until she'd almost forgotten who she used to be. "I want other women to hear this," she told me as she practiced reading it aloud. "I want them to know what this kind of relationship really looks like, so they can recognize it before it gets as bad as mine did." Margaret Chen had warned us that Marcus's attorney would likely present character witnesses and ask for leniency based on his professional accomplishments and lack of prior criminal record. It was a standard defense strategy: paint the abuser as a good man who made mistakes rather than a systematic predator. Sentencing day arrived cold and gray, with the kind of November weather that feels like the world is holding its breath. The courtroom was more crowded this time, filled with Lisa's supporters, domestic violence advocates, and reporters covering the unusual case. Marcus entered in handcuffs, looking smaller somehow than he had during the trial. Jail time had not been kind to a man accustomed to controlling every aspect of his environment. Judge Walsh called the court to order and invited Lisa to read her victim impact statement. My sister walked to the podium with her head held high, every inch the strong woman she'd always been beneath the fear Marcus had imposed on her. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and steady, "3 years ago I married a man who I thought loved me. What I actually married was someone who saw me as property to be controlled, managed, and disciplined when I didn't meet his standards." She detailed the systematic nature of Marcus's abuse, the way he'd isolated her from family and friends, taken control of her finances, and used violence and threats to maintain dominance. She spoke about the fear that had become her constant companion, about losing herself so completely that she'd forgotten she deserved better treatment. "The defendant didn't just hurt my body," she said, looking directly at Marcus. "He tried to destroy my spirit, my sense of worth, my belief that I deserved safety and respect. He came very close to succeeding." Then she turned back to the judge. "But I survived. With the help of people who loved me enough to risk their own safety to save mine, I survived. And I'm here today, not just to see justice served, but to make sure the defendant never has the opportunity to do this to another woman." Marcus's attorney then presented his case for leniency, bringing forward colleagues who testified about Marcus's professionalism and charitable activities. It was a surreal experience, listening to people describe a completely different person than the man who'd terrorized my sister. But character witnesses can only do so much when the defendant has provided hours of recorded confessions detailing his crimes. Finally, Judge Walsh asked Marcus if he had anything to say before sentencing. Marcus stood slowly, and for a moment I thought he might actually show some remorse, some recognition of the pain he'd caused. Instead, he looked directly at Lisa and delivered the most self-serving speech I'd ever heard in a courtroom. "Your Honor, I want to apologize for the pain this situation has caused my wife. I never intended for things to get so out of hand. I was under tremendous stress at work, and I sometimes let that stress affect my behavior at home. As if systematic abuse was just an occasional lapse in judgment. I love my wife," he continued, and I saw Lisa flinch at his words. "I always have. Everything I did was because I wanted to protect her and provide for her. I realize now that my methods were wrong, and I'm committed to getting the help I need to be a better husband. A better husband. Even facing prison time, Marcus couldn't admit that Lisa would never be his wife again, that his actions had permanently destroyed their relationship. Judge Walsh listened to this display with an expression that suggested she'd heard similar speeches too many times to count. "Mr. Hendricks," she said when he finished, "in 23 years on this bench, I have rarely encountered such a disconnect between a defendant's words and actions. You claim to love your wife, yet you systematically abused her for years. You claim your actions were unintentional, yet the evidence shows careful planning and escalation." She paused, consulting her notes. "The court has reviewed the extensive evidence in this case, including hours of recorded statements in which you detailed your methods for controlling and intimidating the victim. These were not moments of stress or lapses in judgment. They were the calculated actions of someone who views domestic violence as an acceptable tool for maintaining control. Furthermore, your complete lack of genuine remorse suggests you represent an ongoing danger to both the victim and potentially to other women in the future." Judge Walsh looked directly at Marcus. "Therefore, I sentence you to 7 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 5 years. Upon your release, you will be subject to a permanent restraining order prohibiting contact with Lisa Foster or any member of her family. 7 years. More than the plea agreement had offered, a clear message that the judge had seen through Marcus's manipulation attempts. As the bailiffs approached to take Marcus away, he turned one last time toward Lisa, his mask finally slipping completely. "You destroyed my life," he said, his voice full of the rage he'd been hiding behind fake remorse. Lisa stood up and looked him directly in the eyes. "No, Marcus. You destroyed your own life. I just made sure there were consequences." It was the perfect response, delivered with the kind of quiet strength that showed exactly how much she'd healed since escaping his control. Marcus was still protesting as they led him away, his voice echoing down the hallway until the heavy doors cut it off. The courtroom erupted in quiet conversations and the rustling of papers, but all I could hear was the sound of justice finally being served. Outside the courthouse, we faced a small crowd of reporters asking questions about the case and its implications for other domestic violence victims. "Do you have any advice for women who might be in similar situations?" one reporter asked Lisa. She thought for a moment before answering. "Trust yourself. If something feels wrong, it probably is. And reach out for help, even if you're scared. There are people who will believe you and fight for you." "Any regrets about how you handled the situation?" another reporter asked me. "Only one," I replied. "I wish I'd figured out what was happening sooner." As we walked to our car, Lisa was quiet, processing the end of a chapter that had defined her life for 3 years. "How do you feel?" I asked. "Free," she said simply. "For the first time in years, I feel completely free." Marcus would spend the next 5 to 7 years in prison, learning what it felt like to have someone else control every aspect of his daily life. The irony was almost poetic. Lisa was starting a new job the following week, had moved into her own apartment, and was cautiously dating a paramedic named David who treated her with the kindness and respect she'd forgotten she deserved. Justice had been served, but more importantly, my sister had reclaimed her life. 2 years later, I was sitting in the audience of a domestic violence awareness conference, watching my sister address a room full of advocates, law enforcement officers, and survivors. The woman speaking from the podium bore little resemblance to the broken person I'd helped escape from the hospital that night. This Lisa was confident, articulate, and passionate about helping other women recognize and escape abusive situations. She'd become a sought-after speaker on the topic of systematic abuse and evidence documentation, sharing our story with audiences across the country. "The most important thing to understand about abusive relationships," she was saying, "is that they don't start with violence. They start with control disguised as love. By the time the physical abuse begins, the victim's support system has often been eroded and their financial independence eliminated." She clicked to a slide showing statistics about domestic violence reporting and prosecution rates. Most cases never result in convictions because abusers are careful to maintain plausible deniability. They commit their crimes in private, then present themselves as loving partners in public. The legal system requires evidence, and evidence is exactly what abusers work hardest to prevent. A hand went up in the audience. "How did you manage to gather such comprehensive evidence in your case?" Lisa smiled. "I had help from someone who wasn't afraid of my abuser because she'd never been conditioned to fear him. My sister Miranda was able to see the situation clearly and act strategically because she wasn't trapped in the psychology of victimization." After the presentation, we met for lunch at Lisa's favorite restaurant, a little place near her apartment where she'd become a regular. The transformation in her life was remarkable. She'd not only survived Marcus's abuse, but channeled that experience into meaningful work helping other women. "I got a letter from Marcus's parole officer yesterday," she mentioned casually over salad. "Oh?" I tried to keep my tone neutral, though any mention of Marcus still made me protective. He's been denied early parole. Apparently, his behavior in prison hasn't shown the kind of remorse and rehabilitation the parole board looks for. I wasn't surprised. Men like Marcus don't suddenly develop empathy and self-awareness just because they're locked up. They usually just get better at hiding their true nature. How do you feel about that? I asked. Relieved, Lisa admitted. I know he can't hurt me anymore regardless, but knowing he's still locked up makes it easier to sleep at night. And how are things with David? Her face lit up at the mention of her boyfriend. They'd been together for over a year now, taking things slowly and building a relationship based on mutual respect and genuine affection. Good. Really good. He's been incredibly patient with all my baggage, and he's never once made me feel like damaged goods. She paused, smiling. We're talking about moving in together. That's wonderful. You deserve someone who treats you well. We both do. Speaking of which, how are things with Detective Morrison? Sarah and I had been together for 18 months, and it was the healthiest relationship I'd ever had. She understood my protective instincts because she shared them, and we'd built something strong and stable together. She asked me to move in with her, I said, grinning at Lisa's excited expression. Miranda, that's huge. What did you tell her? I told her yes, obviously. Life's too short to waste time being careful when someone wonderful wants to share theirs with you. We spent the rest of lunch making plans for Lisa's upcoming move and my own relationship milestone. It was such a normal, happy conversation between sisters, the kind we'd been having all our lives before Marcus had tried to steal Lisa's voice. That evening, I drove past the house where Lisa had lived with Marcus, something I did occasionally just to reassure myself that chapter of our lives was really over. The house had been sold, and new owners had painted it a cheerful yellow and planted flowers in the front yard. It looked completely different, like the site of old trauma had been transformed into something bright and welcoming. My phone rang as I was driving home. Lisa's name appeared on the screen. I forgot to thank you, she said when I answered. For what? For being brave enough to do something crazy when crazy was exactly what the situation needed. For risking your safety to save mine. For showing me that I was worth fighting for when I'd forgotten that myself. Lisa, you don't need to thank me. You're my sister. There's nothing I wouldn't do to protect you. I know, but I needed to say it anyway. After we hung up, I reflected on how much had changed since that whispered phone call from a brave nurse 2 years ago. Marcus was in prison, Lisa was thriving, and both of us had found love with people who treated us with respect and kindness. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like and subscribe for more incredible true stories of survival, justice, and the unbreakable bonds between sisters. And remember, if you or someone you know is in an abusive situation, help is available. You are not alone, and you are stronger than you know. The phone call that started everything had come at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night, a whispered plea from a nurse who risked her job to help a stranger. But the real story began the moment Lisa and I decided that some battles are worth fighting, no matter how dangerous they might be. Marcus had counted on his victim being too broken, too scared, too isolated to fight back. He'd built his entire system of control on the assumption that Lisa would suffer in silence rather than risk his wrath. What he'd never counted on was Lisa having an identical twin sister who'd spent her entire life learning how to outwit bullies and protect the people she loved. In the end, Marcus's greatest strength became his greatest weakness. His arrogance, his need to dominate, his compulsion to brag about his control, all of it was captured and documented by someone he never saw coming. Some people call what we did vigilante justice. I call it love in action, and I'd do it again in a heartbeat. Lisa is free, Marcus is locked away where he belongs, and justice was served with a side of poetic irony. Sometimes the good guys really do win.